Good morning. My name is Andrew Halliburton, and I will be discussing leisure app effects on memory today. And so the problem with this is technology is on the rise already. Like, it's becoming more and more prominent and relevant in everyone else's life. And so it's causing issues already with different aspects of life. However, I'm focusing specifically on memory, which already, as you increase with age, will start to decline because biological factors always impact how you behave later on in life. And so gap that I found within this is, with my first article, it discusses the variable objective sleep quality and its effect on memory. And so the more sleep you have, the more time your brain has to slow down and process and relax and retain information. Whereas if you have less time to sleep, there's also less time to recall anything. And so this article specifically goes into different amounts of sleep that people were receiving, which is where the rough 8 hours comes into play. And so the more sleep people got, the more they're able to remember and retain throughout the night and throughout the rest of the week in their life, compared to if they weren't actually getting enough sleep and the ability to retain that information. And so the second article that I found was this one about effects of prolonged video gaming on sleep as well as memory. And so most people had spent, in this article, a lot of their time up on video games until they weren't getting that sleep at night. And so their video games were impairing their sleep and kind of causing a decrease and a decline in how much sleep they were receiving, relatively different from the required 8 hours or the recommended 8 hours. And so this also had somewhat of an effect on their memory. It wasn't discussed as much as the effect on its sleep, but I did include this one too because it shows electronics overall are having an issue. And so a definition just for leisure apps in general is an app that you don't use for educational purposes or work, so kind of more of something you would go to relax instead of being productive with it instead. And it led me to my initial research question, which was, how is the use of leisure apps leading to a loss of recollection among medical students at Vanderbilt University? And Vanderbilt was easily accessible. It's right down the road from here. But I wasn't able to actually acquire the medical students to use. And so I ended up changing over to my final one, which was, how is the use of leisure apps leading to a loss of recollection among teachers aged 21 to 35 in Middle Tennessee? Middle Tennessee was obvious. It was easy to acquire. It's kind of in the vicinity, and I'm able to get teachers out of that. I did specify teachers because they're always talking to their students about how they shouldn't be using their devices. They're distracting them from their learning. And so I wanted to see if teachers actually upheld that outside of school and if it was causing an issue in their lives whenever they aren't around their students. And then the age period or gap was 21 to 35. So 21 is roughly the time in which your brain will fully develop. So your frontal lobe will finish developing around 21 to 25. And then later on in life, 35 to 40, you'll start to have a decline in your brain functioning. So the memory processing will not have happened as well. And so if I had people beyond 35 and kind of in their later years, it would not have been as fair or as representative of what I was trying to acquire, just because there would have been people who just had their brains fully developed, and then there were others that have the lack going on later on to where they don't remember as much. And so this created my hypothesis where I believed that the excessive usage of these leisure apps would lead to a loss of recollection retained by the teachers, and so we'll see if it gets there. But my method was, I used a mixed method, so the correlational part of my method was to determine if there was a connection between leisure apps and memory formation. And so mainly it was just to see if there was excessive leisure app usage, if there was actually a decline in memory, or if they just happened to happen with different people depending on the person. And so my main source for this was by Kumar et al. There were others. And so it was the prevalence of smartphone addiction as well as sleep. And so what they had done in this article was they determined if people had smartphone addiction through various tests, and then also used the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, which I used in mine, to determine their relative sleep overnight and how long they slept and if there were any interferences while they were sleeping. And so they used the correlational method here in order to determine if there was a correlation between excessive smartphone usage as well as sleep issues later on at night. And then my second method that I had used was a naturalistic observational method, where the teachers were kind of just put to go on about their lives, and I wasn't necessarily interfering. I provided the tests just as a base model, and then, or not base model, but a ground, level of what to use. And so from there, they kind of continued on with their regular life without my interference. And then I got the data from after the elongated period of time. And so this was also used in an article by Michelle Short and Michael Chi, in which they tested adolescents and their sleep to determine if there was an effect on how much sleep they were getting, and then their cognition and their mood later on in the day or in various days after. And so what they had done during this was they let the children go about their regular sleep cycles, and then they tested their cognition and their processing later on throughout the day and throughout the week to determine if there was something going on, but they didn't really have an interference. So it was more of they let the children go about their lives without specifically making them do a certain thing. And then my process started off with, I gathered all the teacher participants into one room and had them view a TED Talk. I made sure that the TED Talk was not subject specific so that people didn't have an advantage on others. So it kind of focused specifically on memory. If I had had someone from a psychology department, I wouldn't have had one about memory just because they would have known more about it. But from where I had teachers from different departments that would not have had necessarily as much information about memory from what they were learning, I was able to use that video so that it kind of created a base ground where everyone was relatively on the same level from what they were watching to what they would understand. And then I waited that 2-week period in which I gave the teachers that 2 weeks to go about their regular lives, use their phones as they normally would, sleep as they regularly would, without my interference or me telling them specifically how long to use their phones or how long to not use their phones. After that, I gave the second test, this time without the TED Talk prior, just to see what they remembered and what they were able to recall from it, as well as the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. And it's not necessarily the most reliable, but I was able to get a relative guess of how much sleep they actually got at night. Because the teachers had to report it on their own, it mainly would have fallen under like a self-serving bias where they would have favored themselves and thought that they had actually done better than they truly had. And so if there was a better way for me to go about logging that specifically, it would have helped significantly. However, this was the closest I could get with what I was able to do. And so it was able to give me relatively how long teachers would sleep at night, and then if there were any interferences with their sleep, as well as if it took them a long time to fall asleep or not. After that, I was able to gather their app data. I used a Google form for this, and so I sent it out to all the teachers, and they went through their settings to the top 5 most used apps that they had. And so what they would do is they would list the app that it was and then the duration that they were on it for their top 5 most used, and then I compiled all those together to get a relative guess of if leisure apps were the highest or not. And then I had also calculated what they were able to forget, so I went through the first test and the second test to figure out what teachers were able to remember and what they actually forgot during that 2-week time period. And I drew connections between each of them, so I determined what teachers were using leisure apps the highest, and if they had a lot of time on them, and if they hadn't had a lot of time on them, and then if they were able to remember more things on the test as compared to if they weren't able to remember those things. And so this is the data from the first testing. As you can see, 50% of the teachers actually got 100%, so they had a perfect score, and almost all of them had a 90 or higher. So they were able to recall the information directly after watching it, and it shows that they had a relatively good understanding of what was in the video. And then the second graph here depicts their sleep after the 2 weeks. So whenever they filled out the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, this blue indicates how long they had slept based on the participant at the bottom. And so that was the time in hours per night. And then the red at the bottom was roughly how long it took them to fall asleep every night. And then the graph on the right, the blue indicates their second test scores. So after taking it the second time, as you can see, most of them ended up falling away from the 100 spot and down into 90 and 80s. And then some of them actually, participant 4 specifically, went up to 100% from where they were originally. And so the red beside indicates their app duration, which correlates to the numbers on the left in hours of how long they spent during that 2-week time period using their phones and using specific apps. And then this final chart here depicts if there were leisure apps that were used or if it was actually purposeful for education or work. And so most of the apps, as you can see here, like TikTok or Instagram, Facebook, were used more prominently than other things, such as like specific internet platforms. And it takes up a majority of this graphic right here, indicating that most teachers spent a lot of their time using leisure apps as opposed to things related to educational or work purposes. And so that's going to be to my results, which was that an increased amount of leisure time, like app usage, did in fact have a correlation with decreased recollection ability. And so the greater there was use of leisure apps, the less people were able to remember on their test, which is why there was a decline later on. And then shorter periods, I actually did not find a connection to. So if there was like a relatively short usage over the 2 weeks, I wasn't able to find a correlation between that and a decrease just because the test scores were kind of where they stayed originally. And then I did find that there is a middle ground roughly between 10 and 20 hours in which scores were able to maintain relatively high results or increase from where they were originally. And then most of the teachers I did realize did not actually reach the required 8 hours of sleep. So either they are staying up later doing their schoolwork for grading, or the leisure apps are having an issue here. And so I did have limitations in what I was doing in that I had a small sample size. I had 6 participants in the very end. I started with 8, but it kind of fell off from there. There are other outside factors that affect sleep. And so not only is the use of leisure apps doing anything, but like I mentioned earlier, grading papers or certain other aspects like staying up late or having different people in the house with you, whereas some people live alone, others won't. there's multiple interferences, and so I wasn't able to calculate all of those. I was focusing specifically on the leisure apps. And then memory formation is also different for everyone. So as I mentioned at the beginning, as you begin to age, like your memory will decline. However, everyone biologically will start to formulate memories differently, regardless of what your age is. I just kind of kept the relative age gap there just so it was kind of in the same area, whereas everyone's going to have different formations of memory over time. I did come to some conclusions though. Since I had a relatively small sample size, it's not representative of an entire population. For future research that happens here, I believe that if they took the same process and then moved it forward and had a larger size to use, it could be more reflective of how many people actually were able to retain based on this use of leisure apps. And again, since everyone's different, there's kind of not necessarily an easy spot to pinpoint whether there is an effect on leisure apps and memory formation. Through all of this though, I was able to gather that like, no matter what the app is, if you spent time up using it, then you were actually losing your memory formation with it. And so it kind of debunks my hypothesis where leisure apps specifically are going to lead to a loss of recollection or like correlate with them. But it does show that just using your phones for elongated periods of time at night leading to it would result in decreased memory. And so I did find like a relative sweet spot, which as mentioned earlier was the 10 to 20 hours. And so as there were participants here, right in here, participants 3 and 4 were between 10 and 20 and were at the highest test scores here. While participant 3 did have 100 originally, it does indicate that she was able to remember what was on the test, as well as participant 4 right here was able to bring their score up. So it does indicate that this relative sweet spot right in here had a better increase for their scores as opposed to the ones that were higher, such as participant 2 who had actually gone over 30 hours. Okay. And that's.
All right, Andrew, thank you so much. All right, oral defense panel, question number 1. How did the choices you made when designing or implementing your research method impact your research process?
So I believe that like the method I had used was able to find a connection between leisure apps and memory formation specifically, whereas I could have had more things factored into it. I guess the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index did incorporate the different things that have an effect on sleep. However, I could have focused more on what was going on. So the method that I chose specifically helped me with drawing connection and a line between if there were leisure apps, or if there was an effect between leisure apps and memory formation.
How did the limitations of your method or data influence your new understanding?
The limitations here presented actually surprised me with, I knew that this small sample size wouldn't be representative. However, the fact that I wasn't able to get this further information about what happens besides leisure apps and electronic usage at night kind of got me to see that there is more going on besides electronics, even though they are becoming more prominent and relevant in our lives. They're not necessarily the only contributing factor to memory loss or sleep loss as well.
Hi, Andrew. Think back to the initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry, and what other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
So I actually think that ties in really well with the previous question too. It gets me to wonder more about if there is specifics about who lives in the house and who's there, as well as how many times you get up throughout the night, as opposed to just leisure app usage for memories. And so that was what I had focused on specifically here. But going through this entire process, it got me to wonder if these different things and different factors that make you lose sleep and lead to a loss of sleep will also cause issues with memory formation and recollection.
All right, Andrew, thank you so much. All right, the floor is now open for general questions.
Yeah, you can take it up.
Okay.
Either way. In one of the research that I was looking at recently about all the things, could you tell by the way you questioned if they were, because the data that I was looking at made there was a discernible difference between people who were actively, like if you were posting or if you were interacting versus just like mindless scrolling. Did you look at that, or did you see anything about that?
I didn't think about that actually until later on, because there are some people who might just have their phones set aside as opposed to those that are actually using them, or just going through such as TikTok and just scrolling through and doing those types of things. I do think that since I can actually go back to it here. Since I had a high usage of TikTok right here, I do think that a lot of people did spend time just kind of scrolling through and not necessarily using them for anything specific. Anything else? No? Nothing? Okay. Yeah? I mean, it's just,
Did any part of your group or any part of your research focus on the app time right before bed? Like if they're laying in bed and you.
so that did not, I wasn't entirely sure how to go about that without like, obviously giving the teacher something to fill out. Hey, what are you doing before bed? Like, did you use your time or your apps? How long was it? And that would have kind of interfered because, again, they would not necessarily have put the most reliable thing with it just because they would have been like, oh, I actually used it for this, when it could have been a longer period of time. So this was more of just over the 2-week span, which could have also included parts of the day, which is also an issue with it. Yes, John.
How does it affect you when you're doing research? Did it affect you?
Not particularly. I don't necessarily, like, I know most people would be like, I actually don't use my phone as much whenever I go to bed. I still don't. I go to bed by 10, so. I didn't heed my own advice with it. I kind of just stayed. It's fine. Yes.
So let's say we all of a sudden had a new teacher here, 21 to 35, that falls in that age group, who had never had a cell phone but has now obtained one. What would your advice be based on your research to that person as they were embarking on using?
I would highly, highly advise, like I could go through this entire point with them. That'd be great. I could show them all. I would highly advise not to spend an upwards of 30 hours on their phone at a time because that was my lowest scoring one besides this one over here. But that one had been the same. That one was 80% the entire time, whereas participant 2, their score actually went down and they spent an excessive amount of time on their apps.
And so how did you define the sweet spot? You said there was a sweet spot now.
Yeah, so it was this period right here between 10 and 20 hours just because, okay, so back here on this one, participant 3 already had 100%, 1 and 2 had 100% as well, but 4 had 90%. And participant 3 maintained their 100, and then participant 4 actually increased their score to a 100%, whereas the other ones had higher than 20 or lower than 20 in this case, and they all went down or stayed where they were before.
And then my other favorite question
Okay.
to ask is, what did you learn about yourself from this process of conducting research?
I learned that I actually don't use my phone as much as I thought I did. Like, significantly less than I thought I did. Y'all teachers are great, though. Anything else?
I loved your group that you tested. I think that's, because you're right, we are always telling, we have to make sure that I find myself at night, so even myself being on it more than I should.
Mm.
And I didn't grow up with a phone. I didn't, it wasn't in my background.
See, that was kind of also like an influence on my little 21 to 35 because they're relatively in a technological era. Whereas if I had gone later on, not only would they not have remembered as much because of biological factors, but there are some people that wouldn't actually have had phones as a younger person.
I'd be curious to see its impact on attention span.
That's what I
Wrote in my notes, attention span.
like attention span and focus.
Chance?
Sure it is kind of
Did you think about analyzing like specific like web? It's really surprising me that the internet platform was only like 2% of all.
Yeah, no, I honestly did not expect this. I expected
Oh, yeah.
at least something school related to pop up.
Yeah.
But I mean, unless they're texting about school grades and stuff.
There's no games, too,
There's not. I did notice that.
unless they fall in the other category.
No, most of that was like, there were school things in that, but it's kind of broken down into every person had one specific thing or 2 things that nobody else had. And so that would have kind of, what are you laughing at? Okay. That would have kind of broken it down into different things.
Yeah, everyone's different.
If you did it with the younger age group, that Snapchat number would be much higher, I would say. Facebook is
Yeah.
non-existent.
Yeah. I mean, I'm surprised TikTok was as high as it was, and Instagram. Instagram's up really high too, though. Anything else?
Guys, any
Other
other
questions?
You did great.
Thank you.
All right.
Bo?
Did you use like the goal say it's 21 to 35 to get like a certain generation, or is that just what it was like?
No, it wasn't first. It was specifically because, like, whenever you hit 21, that's when your frontal lobe will develop roughly, and then kind of beyond 35, your brain formation or memory formation goes down. So it's not the right thing to say in this spot, but you know.
That's right.
Okay.
All right, guys, other
Any other
questions?
questions?
All right,
Yes,
Andrew,
number
thank you so
7? No.
much.
Okay. Here, I'll turn it off. Okay.